Hi, come on in again. Thanks for calling round. I thought it might be quite fun this time to talk a little bit about the pictures on the wall of my study of the library here. You've probably seen a few of them as you've wandered around on previous occasions. I've like the books; they all mean something to me. I mean, there's this lovely one which is all made of cut wood. It's actually not painted; it's inlaid wood. Maggie gave me that, and it makes me think of the beautiful Thames barges on the River Orwell, near where I used to keep a boat. And there are paintings here by my grandmother, by Rebecca Merry, who did the cover of Sounding the Seasons. And we'll look at them all in more detail later. There's one or two of mine. There's my friend Linda's done this wonderful one of Leonard Cohen looking down on things. But probably you've noticed when we've occasionally come over to my desk before, you've noticed this rather striking picture, which you may well have recognised is C.S. Lewis. But it's the young C.S. Lewis. And it means a lot to me, this. You know, one usually sees the pictures of Lewis in middle-aged, looking rather earnestly and doggedly out at you. Heavy Lewis, as he used to call himself then. But here's the young man, you know, back from the Western Front, brilliant young Don at Oxford. And this was made, I mean, it's based, of course, on a photo of Lewis, but it's a beautiful painting made by the great Northern Irish artist Ross Wilson, whom happily I've come to know. And he gave this to me, and he calls this Jack of Hearts for M.G. Best Regards, Ross. Ross Wilson made that amazing statue that you can see in East Belfast of the wardrobe and the man looking rather like the young Lewis getting up to open the wardrobe door. And he also did the portraits of both Lewis and Seamus Heaney that are in Stormont. But I like this, and it draws me and makes me think of young Lewis, not yet a Christian, but full of those ardent yearnings, those stabs of joy, those contradictions between his philosophical atheism and his intuitive yearning for the transcendent. And wrestling with it all through poetry. He wanted to be a poet most of all. And I thought it might be fun. I'm going to take down a couple of books here that have a kind of relation, or a passage in them does. This is the letters over a lifetime Lewis sent to his Belfast friend Arthur Greeves. It's called They Stand Together. And this is the wonderful new scholarly edition of Lewis's poems, edited by Don King, who's a great expert on those poems. So let's just go and sit over again. And I just want to read you two kind of related passages where we get a glimpse of Lewis as the ardent young letter writer, and also of Lewis, Lewis the poet. So let me tell you a little bit first before I read this. I've got something that Ross wrote to me about that picture, which he calls Jack of Hearts. You know, of course, Lewis' nickname was Jack. He says, Jack of Hearts, Malcolm, the image you have, is of Lewis in his early 20s. It's a type of backward glance, a realization of providence, of sovereign perseverance in the forming of a saint, of a long calling from youth to come further up and further in. A young survivor from a lost generation, because of course, like his friend Tolkien, he was a young officer on the Western Front and wounded in the Great War. A young survivor from a lost generation, touched by loss but enlightened by the continued gift and grace of life. Known by, and yet not knowing, the great angler who had his hook well fastened in that young life, who God would land and use to bring countless others to the further shore. Basically a young life that was filled with anticipation through unknown grace that would be revealed in and through Christ. A heart touched by Christ that in turn would also touch many other hearts. And it's lovely to have that tribute to Lewis from Ross. I mean, one Irishman to another. Lewis saw himself as very much an Irishman. And what I wanted to do was to give you something Lewis wrote in a letter to his other Irish friend Arthur Greeves about the great Irish poet of his day, Yeats. And not many people are aware that Lewis, the ardent poet himself and reader of poetry, got to meet Yeats. And there's an amazing description of being in Yeats's room, in Yeats's study, just as you're coming into mind. It was a very funny room, writes Lewis. The light was supplied by candles, 2 of them in those 6-foot candlesticks that you see before the altar in some English churches. There were flame-coloured curtains, a great many pictures, and some strange foreign-looking ornaments that I can't describe. And he goes on to describe Yeats. Yeats himself is a very big man, very tall, very fat, and very broad. His face gives one the impression of vast size. There would have been no mistaking which was the man we had come to see, however many people had been in the room. Grey-haired, about 60 years of age, clean-shaven, glasses with a thick tape. His voice sounded rather French, I thought at first, but the Irish shows through after a bit. I have seldom felt less at my ease before anyone than I did before him. I understand the Dr. Johnson atmosphere for the first time. What it was like that, we all sitting round, putting in judicious questions, while the great man played with some old seals on his watch chain and talked. A wonderful account. Now, in fact, when I came to read Lewis's long poem Dymer, written not long after this letter, which was written in the 20s, there's a character in the poem Dymer who's a magician. And I realised that, in fact, the account of the magician in the 6th canto of Dymer is drawing clearly on those very details, that perhaps on the very letter itself, when the magician appears. Let me read to you. I rather like, it's an almost completely forgotten poem now, Dymer, and it didn't do very well. So the hero goes into the garden of the gates where the magician is. And the little allusions, I think, to the Lake Isle of Innisfree here. So here's Lewis's poem. He heard the noise of bees and saw far off in the blue shade between the windless elms one walking on the green. It was a mighty man whose beardless face beneath grey hair shone out so large and mild it made a sort of moonlight in the place. A dreamy desperation, wistful, wild, showed in his glance and gait. Yet, like a child, an Asian emperor's only child was he, with his grave looks and bright solemnity. And over him there hung the witching air, the wilful courtesy of the days of old, the graces wherein idleness grows fair. And somewhat in his sauntering walk he rolled and toiled about his waist with seals of gold, or stood to ponder often in mid-stride, tilting his heavy head upon one side. You can see just how all the details in that bit of poetry have been sort of transformed into verse, a kind of beautiful literary alchemy from the base metal, if you like, the raw account in scarcely base metal. It's great writing here too, in the letter to Greeves. I love to think of that. The young Lewis, enchanted, awed, and yet at the same time, I think a little frightened and reserved about the magical air that hung around the great poet, as Yeats called himself, the 60-year-old smiling public man. Next time you drop in, what we might do, actually, prompted by that, is I've got various volumes of Yeats, as you would expect, and we might take one of those off the shelves and read a little bit of that magical Yeats to one another. It'll be good to see you then.